Yeah, it's a great pleasure now to hand you over to Tim M from London. Take it away, Tim.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tim. I'm an addict, uh, also an alcoholic. My main fellowships are AA and Al-Anon. I've been to a lot of CA meetings as well. And I know there are slight differences in wording between the traditions in different fellowships, but I won't concern myself with that. This isn't going to be a technical analysis. I'm looking more at general principles. Uh, I've got 40 minutes on all 12 traditions, and next week we're going to have 40 minutes on the 12 traditions as principles to apply to life. 40 minutes will barely be long enough just to cover tradition one. There's an awful lot that can be said about them. So this will be spits and spots about different traditions. We may get through one, we may get through all of them. We'll see. Uh, I don't have any special credentials. I'm not an AA historian. I'm not anything. I'm just a sort of bog standard AA member. Um, but I have been sober for 32 years, and what that does mean is I've seen a lot. I've seen what works, I've seen what doesn't work, and I've been part of what works and what doesn't work. So I think that's important. One tiny thing about where the traditions came from, they weren't imposed from on high. We're very lucky that any 12-step fellowships exist at all because early AA was frankly on the verge of breaking down in all sorts of different ways, in all sorts of different places. And the traditions were, as they say, hammered out on the anvil of experience. Essentially, they're what's left when you cut out everything which doesn't work. And the things which didn't work resulted in the collapse of groups and therefore the loss to AA of the people who are members of those groups on many occasions, especially where AA was very small in a particular place, in a city. If there was one group and that group fell apart, that was the end of AA there. So it's very important, this. Uh, One thing I've noticed as well, I sponsored a lot of people in AA and I've sponsored a lot of people in CA. And I've never understood why this is the case, but the CA people I've sponsored, they love rules. I don't know why. It's a complete mystery. AAs, phew, forget it. And Al-Anons are something else. That's a different fellowship entirely. But CA, oh, people love the rules and pointing out the rules. And they're not rules, the traditions, they're principles. And the difficult thing about them is they work against each other, which means you've got to take all of them into account at all times. Uh, it's terribly easy to misuse the traditions, and you come up with what you think the right thing to do is, and then you try to find the traditions which support your point of view because you've already made up your mind. But now you need the legal backing to support it, and that's a very common thing to do. So, those are some very basic principles. I've got to look at these as spiritual principles, which means I'm to apply them honestly and sincerely, trying to seek God's will, because that's what's behind the whole thing. What's behind the whole set of traditions is the set of 12 steps, which seek to eliminate me as a factor in my life and to leave me simply as a quiet servant of God. And traditions are there to help me do that together with other people in AA. And as I say, it applies to any fellowship. So whenever I say AA, you can hear CA in practice. It's how we stay together to do our job in AA within the group. But the traditions also cover relations within the fellowship and a little bit the relations to the outside world. There's a whole separate question of the 12 concepts, which is how service gets done. but we're not going to be covering that. Now, the most important tradition is the first one, which is unity. And the first thing that comes to mind with unity is it happens less in Great Britain. I'm not sure about Ireland, but it certainly happens a lot in America that a certain amount of branding happens. So rather than a meeting just being a group, just being an AA group, it's a primary purpose group, or it's a back to basics group, or it's a big book awakening group, or a this group, or a that group. And I very much like there was an AA speaker who died probably 20 years ago now, who registered his home group as an AA group because it says in the traditions any two or three people can call themselves an AA group. So that was the name of the group, an AA group. There was no sense of a special little group of people who've got the special information, the real stuff. There's a real danger, especially in the bits of recovery world where one really has found a very spectacular solution in the big book. So something which is far more effective in practice than simply going to meetings and sharing about the week. That's all very nice, but it won't do very much for one's addiction or alcoholism. There's a real danger of separating oneself in AA to become this special group or cohort within it, separate from the rest. And you'll even hear it on some speakers who are very well regarded, perhaps quite rightly, in AA and CA, who talk about middle of the road AA as being them over there. We won't have anything to do with them because they're all getting it wrong. I don't think that works. In London, I've seen big book groups or other very strong meetings set themselves apart and telling sponsees, here are the meetings you go to, don't go to the other ones because they're terrible. Unity is very important. I need to be able to go anywhere in AA and be completely at home. And also, even if I do in my home group AA very differently to the way they do it somewhere else, not to throw my weight around in groups where they do it differently, but simply to respect the format, the tone, the tenor of other groups. So it's important that the group have good relations with other groups. There's a city which shall remain nameless in England where they've actually rather fostered a culture of separateness, this very strong group. And it's got the most appalling reputation. It's a very good group. They get a lot of people sober through real sort of rigor, and they wear suits and ties, and it's all very uh, military, and it's very effective for a certain type of person, but they made enemies with the rest of the city, and I don't know how that can be healed. I don't think that's what I aim for. I aim to simply be a member of AA, a member of a group, which is one group among many, and the people at my group they go all over London, and there isn't this sense of separation. Unity within the group as well. Uh, the biggest source of disunity I've come across in AA groups stems from business meetings and group conscience meetings. And what I have learned over the years is that almost every idea I have about improving the group comes from some sort of gripe or grievance I've got against the group or some people in it. And I think, I know what will fix it. And I have one of my bright ideas. And then the bright idea gets proposed and it splits the group in two. Um, I was trying to help someone in recovery a few years ago who was in another country. Let's call it Ruritania, which isn't a country, but let's call it that. And they'd got the hang of the traditions and the concepts to a certain extent, but they were having these business meetings and group conscience meetings. And I said, and this person was getting their knickers in a twist about these business meetings. And I said, why? And she said, well, they're just so long. The last business meeting was 4 hours long, and everyone was arguing by the end of it. And oh, it was awful. And we've still got 37 more proposals to work through. If I want unity within my home group, honestly, I'm best off keeping my mouth largely shut, having as few ideas as possible. And I was a member of a group many years ago, in my first 10 years, so this was in the 1990s, where if they'll pardon me for saying so, and I include myself in this, it was, to quote someone else, it was like the bar in Star Wars. It was a very strange collection of people. People who normally would not mix was an understatement to describe this room. But that's an ideal group, a group where you look at it and you're like, whoa, what have these people got in common? And there were some mistakes in the script. And I think over the sort of 8 or 9 years, my first 8 or 9 years in AA, no one called for a group conscience to have the script fixed. They just left it be. And it was a very unified group. I became a secretary of that group when I was 13 or 14 years sober. And I came with all my bright ideas and I caused such a ruckus. I was almost drummed out of the group for doing so. So honestly, for a group to remain unified, simplicity, in my experience, is absolutely the best. And what I tell you what you need for a group to operate, you need tea and coffee, and you need a kettle, you need some milk, you need some biscuits. Get those in place way ahead of time. You need a script. A minute of script before people start talking is about enough. You don't want 15 minutes of readings. You don't want the same readings every week. Boring, dull. Uh, just get straight into human beings talking about their addiction and their recovery. And then at the end, simple little prayer, boom, done, go home. If that's the group, it doesn't need much in the way of business meetings or group consciences unless something comes along like the venue says you can't have the meeting anymore. Or if there's disruption from someone who is violent, you might have to have a policy on how to handle violent people. Fine. But to keep the group happy, to keep the group unified, keep the ideas to a minimum, only deal with the problems that really have to be faced. Don't create new ones with cleverness. And following on from that, tradition two, God's in charge. Now, what that means, guess what? I'm not in charge. And I've tried being in charge, and you can do it, and you can end up with a group which is 3 times the size. And it absolutely works. There are ways of doing that. But my God, the strain that produces on the individuals who put themselves in charge. Uh, this links into the notion of rotation. So my home group, face to face in London, which is just off Brick Lane, has been going since 2009, and I didn't go for a couple of years during lockdown. It was online then, and I didn't go during that period. I started going back about 3 years ago, and I did a lot of running of that group for a long time, and I don't now. I do little jobs here and there. Um, and don't tell anyone this. I don't attend the business meetings. I'm leaving other people to do that. I'm taking a break from that. So rotation means to rotate all the way out of that service, and otherwise other people don't learn how to do it. One of the dangers with being 20 years sober, 30 years sober, when there's no one else in the room or few other people in the room who are 20 or 30 years sober, is whenever there's a problem in a business meeting or a group conscience, people look at you. And even if you're saying nothing, people are looking for the look on the old timer's face or the long timer's face to get the yay or the nay on things. Best to stay well out of it. And what I've noticed in Brick Lane is people who are much younger in sobriety really stepping up to the plate and figuring things out with their higher powers, with their conscience, and still consulting. I get calls from people, what are the principles which apply in this situation? There are different ways to be of service. Sometimes it means you're sitting there with your little pad and your little pen and you're up front and you're doing stuff. Sometimes you're the person that people quietly have a little word in their shell like to discuss matters arising. There's more than one way to do this. And the group used to be around 70 or 80 people at one point. At the moment, we're averaging, I think we're usually between 30 and 45. But honestly, that's a really good size because it means everyone pretty much knows everyone else. No one is falling through the cracks. If there is a newcomer, if there is a visitor, we know straight away because we know everyone in the meeting. If someone is unfamiliar, we'll know they're unfamiliar and we know to say hello to them. It's pretty difficult to walk through the door and not be noticed. And we go for dinner afterwards, important part of unity. It's the really important bit of the meeting, really. And there are a good 25 people at dinner. Um, but as I say, God is in charge, which means almost everything doesn't need my interference. It works itself out. So no backroom deals, no muttering in the corridors. Let the business be transacted in the business meeting, in the group conscience meeting. Let God speak through the group conscience meeting. And if it's wrong, it's let it be a terrible mistake. That's the worst thing it can be, and then it'll be reversed. Uh, Tradition three, this notion of anyone can join uh, who is entitled to be there and not requiring any conformity. I was given an idea many years ago by a sponsor uh, specifically about this, and it was this idea of a corral for horses where you have very strong fences round the edge, but then the horses are allowed to run freely within in order that they can be tamed and then trained. But you need both. And this lack of enforced conformity means that there's absolutely no policing of what people say in the meeting. There are some groups one goes to where the roster of minute rules that have to be followed about what can be said and what can't be said and how you're to handle other people in the meeting and you're to interact with them before or after the meeting and during the meeting and between the meetings and on the phone and all these rules. There's no freedom in that. There's no ability to make mistakes. There's no ability to learn from experience. Um, the safest environment for me is one where I'm allowed to be myself and no one is wagging their little censorious finger at me telling me what to do. That's safety because then people can be what they are. I've been to meetings where if someone goes off topic, they're interrupted and asked to bring it back on topic. I mean, occasionally there's an exception. Someone veers off into verbal attack against someone. Maybe that should be shut down, but maybe not. Maybe the right thing is, I've seen it happen actually, where someone goes into that. And at the end of it, everyone says, thanks for sharing. And it just takes all the wind out of it. And it didn't require any police in any sense. I've been to meetings where a good proportion of the people are very seriously mentally ill, and the sharing reflects that. And everyone says thank you for sharing at the end of it, just like they do when someone shares some good sense. So people are allowed to be who they are, and the only constraint is 3 minutes, bell goes off, you're done. Give someone else a turn. And that's the radical democracy. Everyone gets the same share of the meeting in terms of the time to share. Tradition four, each group can do what it wants as long as it doesn't affect the fellowship as a whole or other groups. It's very, very difficult to affect another group. The one interesting example I see sometimes of how uh, a group is said to affect another group is in a small town or small city when, let's say, there's a meeting at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, and then someone else sets another meeting up at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday, half a mile away. And there are a couple of cities in England where the custom is that you get the other group's permission to set up. To me, that's going a little bit too far because there's a great democracy about AA. People get to choose which meetings they go to, which means that if you got two meetings at the same time and the group and the city can't sustain two, the better one, the more effective one will win. And that's healthy. There's no point in keeping groups alive for the sake of it. But in most places, that's not the case. If you want to set up a group, you set up a group and that's the end of it. And it's very hard to affect the fellowship as a whole, which means Liberty Hall. And it also means that if I don't like what another group is doing, that's none of my business. And I shouldn't say a word about it. Tradition five, this idea of primary purpose, let's read it out. Each group has but one primary purpose to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. Uh, Sometimes it's held that because of that, groups should really limit what they're sharing to very tightly to the big book and the steps, and very naughty to talk about anything else. I went to a meeting in Oakland in California many years ago. Um, and to me, it was an excellent example. It was an excellent example of a very strong group. And the funny thing was, I was going through one of my militant phases, and these phases are very unattractive, but people often go through them after the spiritual awakening. It wears off. If you give it long enough, it'll wear off. So if you're in the middle of one, don't worry, give it a couple of years, you'll come back down to earth and start to be a regular person again. Anyway, I was going through one of those phases, and halfway through the first half of the meeting, I was huffing inside to myself, saying, well, this is just ridiculous. No one's mentioned God, no one's mentioned the steps. But then I really started to listen, and in the second half, yeah, people were just sharing about their week and sharing about their day, but every word they were saying was expressing the application of the principles of the program without them having to say words like pitiful and incomprehensible, demoralization, or meeting a man who was armed with the facts. They didn't need to be quoting the book to be carrying the message. I think the main application of tradition five is that, and this is going to be controversial, sometimes special interest groups, I'd always fight for their right to exist. But the focus of the meeting can go off alcoholism onto the identity that people share in common. So I used to, for many years, go to various gay and lesbian groups, and I still occasionally will go. I'm going to a young person's convention. I used to be young, apparently. Next weekend, it's been a long time. Um, they say it's okay as long as you're young at heart. I'm not even young at heart. I'm very old at heart, so I don't know. Maybe they won't let me through the door when I get there. But anyway, I used to go to gay and lesbian meetings. And in the early 90s, that meant there were gay meetings. There were a couple of lesbians. That was it. It was almost all gay men. Whenever there was trouble, all the gay men would stand on their chairs and scream, and it was the lesbians who dealt with it. So thank God there are at least a couple of lesbians there who had the character to deal with problems because we didn't. But now some weeks it was really good, and but other weeks, if someone mentioned something to do with being gay, then everyone shared about that. That became the focus. And I've seen that happen in illness, in recovery meetings, in various other meetings. Men's meetings are very strange things. People wear more expensive watches. I've never understood, but they do. And they're playing with their watches. They want to show all the other men. Women, that's what goes on in men's meetings. It's nothing more sinister than that. And there's kind of a swagger as well, especially the way in which people talk about girlfriends or whatever. It's very strange. Or there's an effort to show that, we're men, but we can be sensitive in the way that people feel they perhaps can't in front of women. I don't know but it's just different. And I like meetings where there's just the only thing we've really got in common is the addiction and recovery, and that not having other demographic limitations means that the lowest common denominator is the addiction and recovery, and that's all that gets talked about. Some other points. Every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. There are two ways of handling this financially. I'm of the view that I contribute financially at my home group. I don't contribute financially at other groups. I'm not there to subsidize other groups. I put my hand in my pocket at my home group. But this is not just financial. This is also practical. For a group to be healthy, there have to be enough members who are regular on a weekly basis to put their hands in their pockets to pay for it and to be willing to do the service required. One of the phenomena you get in central London, which is a big enough place with enough meetings that I can say this without targeting any particular meeting. I've been to groups, I've been to meetings where the meeting has 70 people in it. There are 3 people doing service. They can barely get anyone to do any service. And the pot goes round and everyone puts money in. So the group stays alive financially, but it's not really fully self-supporting. It's supported by donations from non-group members week after week after week. But there's no one to do the service, and there's no group ethos. There's nothing to hold the group together. And that's why I think the principle of you give at your home group, but not at other groups, you do service at your home group, but not at other groups. I think that is what makes for a healthy group, because that allows groups that don't have cohesion, that are not valued sufficiently for people to contribute, to go by the wayside and make place for something else. Uh, I'm not a gardener, but I grew up with gardeners. And what I'm aware of is that you don't allow everything to grow. You do an awful lot of pruning. You do an awful lot of yanking out of things that are never gonna survive. There's no point in keeping a group on life support indefinitely. It's best to let the radical democracy of God speaking through group consciences to allow people to just go where works for them rather than artificially keeping places alive. Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centres may employ special workers. I suppose this does stray a little bit over into the application in one's life, but maybe that's a different topic. But I was at a meeting a number of years ago where a chap said he did a good chair, very respectable. But he said AA is very good, but it won't do any good for your low self-worth. If you've got low self-worth, the steps won't help with that, and the program won't help with that. You'll need therapy for that. And he managed to shoehorn into another part of his share the fact that he was a therapist who specialized in helping people in recovery who had low self-worth. This is an example of not having bulkheads between different areas of your life. Fair play to him. If he wants to go and be a therapist, he can do what he wants. But one doesn't bring it into the room. I think it's terribly important in AA to give absolutely no indication when one is in the room, what one does for a living, how big one's house is, what one's car is, where one gets to travel to. All of those little markers of difference, and in particular, what one is doing for a living, because that can get leveraged. This, I think, hooks into uh, tradition six, not lending our name to other things means not lending our identity to other things. But back to the tradition eight business, uh, I have no opinion on whether it is right for people in recovery ever to work in treatment and all of the recovery industry, as it's called, and so on. But what I do know is that I've seen people come terribly unstuck doing it for lots of different reasons. People unable to go to local meetings and speak freely because their employer literally says you can't speak freely at the local meetings, or sometimes they've even said you can't even go because it will compromise the confidentiality with patients or whatever, or the patient counselor distance. I've seen people actively try and recruit for their businesses within AA. But I think the main thing is not monetizing what I've received for free. So, uh, of course, I've got an interest, and I've thought about this a number of times. Is there a way in which I could do something spiritual for a living, or do something which is recovery related for a living? And the guidance I've got from the higher power time and time again is absolutely not. Go and to get a normal job like a normal person. Just earn your living and keep this entirely separate. It leaves a very sour taste in the mouth when you see people monetizing what they've received from other AA members for free on the phone and in person, day after day, year after year. And suddenly now they've got a book. Very good. Well done. Where's the money going? Um, it poisons the whole deal. The whole basis of my recovery is to become an unpaid employee of God, passing on each day everything that has been given to me for free again and again and again. And page 19 has a clear separation. Page 19 of the big book has a clear separation between, on one hand, spending much of our free time engaged in the kind of work we're going to describe, namely 12 step work, carrying the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. And on the other hand, home occupations and affairs. Now, the home occupation and affairs, those are the areas in which I can demonstrate most successfully that the program works. Those are the worked examples, although the most important thing itself is the carrying of the message. So those external things are a vehicle for carrying the message. But I keep the two things entirely separate, and that keeps it healthy. If you've sponsored a lot of people, and or if you've worked in the industry, you'll have noticed, and perhaps just looking at yourselves, I've certainly noticed it looking at myself. And this is just a little secret between me and you, is alcoholics and addicts aren't very well. And alcoholics and addicts who are sober 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, 30 years aren't necessarily very well. At least when they were drinking, they were passed out for 18 hours a day. Now they're sober, they're up and they're perky and up in everyone's business. Having a lot of contact with other alcoholics and addicts drains you in a way that other things just don't. One encounters the same patterns again and again and again and again and again. And one builds up mechanisms for handling those and remaining relatively detached and or completely detached and poised and not and being able to respond to those difficult situations with patience and tolerance, but it takes its toll. The last thing I would want is to have that kind of energy in my work life and in my home and in my free time. Forget it. I need a normal day where I'm just dealing with normal people. AA as such ought never be organised. This is the ninth, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. That spirit of service applies whenever I'm doing service in AA, which means that I am permitted, as it were, permit myself to be overridden by the group conscience without complaint. So I've done service at national level in AA, so work which is directly to the board. And I can't tell you how many times what I thought was a good idea was overridden either by the committee I was on or by the board member who was on the committee. And the response to that is not to argue or to push my point forcefully, but just to say, okay, what should we do instead? And this attitude of service and being part of something bigger, I think it's a very important principle. Ever since I've been in AA, there has been a cohort of people who are up in arms about the General Service Board and the conference, but particularly the General Service Board and the General Service Office. You keep your ear to the ground, and there are always rumblings and complaints. There always have been, there always will be. But AA has saved my life, and I cannot afford to be a rebel. I need to cooperate constructively with the service structure that's there, not try to form a separate structure, not to try to battle against this establishment of the service structure. My job is to serve it, and that is it. That is the only way that change ever gets affected in a constructive and helpful way. In my home group as well, the idea is that I simply am there to serve it. If I disagree with things, if the group conscience has spoken, that's the end of it. Being sober 30 years doesn't give my voice any more weight because of that. There might be experience which can be thrown into the ring for people to do with as they wish. That's a different matter. Um, Three more traditions to go and 2 minutes. Tradition 10, no opinion on outside issues. I think it's a jolly good idea in meetings not to mention religion specifically, not to mention politics. There are other things too. Newcomers to AA will not know that the person speaking is speaking for themselves. They will hear that person as speaking for AA. I was with a Catholic newcomer many years ago, and someone shared from the floor, yeah, I'm a recovering Catholic, tee hee hee. And a half a dozen other people weighed in, also saying they were recovering Catholics and trotting out the usual things that people say against the Catholic Church. And the newcomer at the end said, this is obviously not a good place for someone who is a practicing Catholic. One's got to be terribly careful because people are listening and watching. Attraction rather than promotion. There's a very good example of that, and this is in business meetings and group consciences. If I've got an idea, I say the idea, and that's the end of it. If it is good, it will be bought automatically. I do not need to promote the idea. If it's not agreed with, if it's not understood, it's a terrible idea. Let it drop. So I never need to enter into an argument. Say it once and then I'm done. At the level of the fellowship as a whole, and this is not well understood. Sometimes people think you're not allowed to advertise, fellowships aren't allowed to advertise. If you want to really understand the traditions, read Language of the Heart, which is the collection of Bill Wilson, the co-founder of AA's Grapevine writings. And they're great because they resolve ambiguities. And he makes it very clear in there. We must advertise. We're Alcoholics Anonymous, as it says elsewhere, not Alcoholics Invisible. But what we're to do is to avoid lurid accounts and sensational promotional practices. So when you see the posters, they're often very discreet. If alcohol costs you more than money, then maybe we can help. And we let it go at that. We don't promise more than that. And finally, this anonymity business, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities. This means in a business meeting or a group conscience meeting, it matters what people are saying, not who says it. Just because a friend is saying it does not mean it's right. Just because someone who's 20 years sober is saying it does not mean it's right. I've got to listen out for the underlying ideas. And what's interesting is God's truth I tend to apprehend in a relaxed way. Anything that gets me riled up is unlikely to be coming from God. What lets me breathe and what lets air into the room tends to be God speaking through the person at that moment. And with 8 seconds to go, I'm going to shut my trap for some questions.
Great, Tim. Thank you so much. So the meeting room is now open. We at this meeting we use the raised hand format. If you would like to ask a question on what the topic of the traditions, please click on the three dot icon, reactions, participants at the bottom of the screen, or else you can put your question into the chat. So we can get the questions kicked off. The room is open.
Do you have any questions, Keith, to start us off? I'm sure you have.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, I do. The one of the topics was that came up actually in our home group is that when you read out the like a safety statement or something that the group how does it back it up with the principles? You know, like we do not tolerate bullying or any sexual or harassment behavior or anything like that. How does the group as a whole back up that statement?
Okay, this is a big topic. So now we're getting on to the good stuff. Very good. Okay, so I'm going to share some experience. It may be controversial. If it's helpful, use it. If it's not, don't worry about it. Um, I can say very clearly that the phenomenon of arseholes coming to AA is not new. It hasn't suddenly appeared in the last 2 or 3 years. There were arseholes and crank and whatever and creeps 30 years ago. I'm sure there were 50 years ago. I'm sure there were 60 years ago. Now, you've got two aspects of this. You've got the conduct of the group's business, and then you've got the personal relations between the members of the group. Now, the conduct of the group's business, this is where uh, tradition one comes in. So common welfare comes first. What is the common welfare? That we can conduct our meeting uh, in an orderly fashion. We can transact our business, which is to talk about the step or the tradition or the bit of the big book, or to have someone tell their story, or to do the birthdays, or whatever it is, whatever you've decided to do. Your job is to do that. And so anyone who seeks to disrupt that, um, group welfare comes first. And so the group empowering the secretary at the front, or whatever you call the person who's running the meeting, empowering them to gradually escalate through. You first of all ask them to pipe down, and then you say, if you don't pipe down, then I'm afraid you're going to be asked to leave. And then it escalates to having a couple of people ready to actually physically remove the person if they are continuing to disrupt the meeting. You're not removing them from AA. They are still an AA member. They're just not allowed to disrupt everyone else's recovery. And page 263, I think it's correct, that of Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers say uh, that when they had disruptions in early days in AA, they would take the disrupting person. And 9 out of 10 people who are disrupting are simply drunk or mad. So you take them out, you talk to them, you just sit with them outside. Four of you go and sit with them, have a little meeting outside. And you just say very kind of, look, you're very welcome in AA. We're very glad you're here, but you can't do that because this group is for everyone. But if you want to talk, we'll sit outside and talk to you. And I've done that. I've been part of a little cohort of people that has gone, taken the difficult person outside. I've been in meetings where we've had to call the ambulance because someone's having an episode and they clearly need some help. We're worried about them not being able to get home safely afterwards because they're not in contact with reality. You see that. So sometimes there is some disruption which needs to be dealt with. When it's particularly um, persistent and the person's attendance really does become, in order to disrupt a person, a group conscience can come together and say, you know what, we're going to have a break from this person for 6 months. Now, if it's the only group in town, that's tricky because that could be tantamount to prohibiting them from attending 12-step meetings. But if this is done through enough layers of escalation and it's the last resort, I think it's reasonable because you can lose 10 people, you can lose 20 people because of one genuinely dangerous disruptor. And the disruptors sometimes are actually physically threatening, and I've seen that happen, and that does need to be dealt with. Um, Now, there's a big difference between someone disrupting and the interpersonal behavior between the members of the group and the relations between members of the group when they're no longer in the room, when they're walking home, who sponsors who, how sponsors talk to sponsees, what interaction people have. Now, there are obviously, self-evidently, some people in recovery who like to mix things up a bit and use AA as, shall we put it bluntly, a knocking shop, places to pick people up for a bit of this and a bit of that. And some of those may well be sex addicts, who knows? And that's always happened, and I'm sure it always will happen. Um, Now, the thing is, when I was new in AA, I was in my early 20s, gay man. Um, uh, and I was the object of attentions, some of which were wanted, some of which were unwanted. Um, but I was an adult. I was not vulnerable by virtue of being an alcoholic. I'd been perfectly capable of navigating those situations for years outside AA. As someone said locally, they've survived the crack houses of Hackney. I'm sure they can. I'm sure they can handle a fumbled pass by the tea table. People know how to handle this. I knew how to handle it. Now, if people don't, they can be taught. Get a sponsor, say, so and so is pestering me. What do I do? And they'll be shown how to respond robustly. I think my job as a sponsor in AA is to teach other people in the group who don't know how to do it, how to respond to unwanted attentions, whether it's by text, by telephone call, or in person, because that's going to happen out there too. If someone doesn't know how to handle it, then they're going to be in trouble the other 23 hours of the day. What are we going to do? Send people out to make sure there's there's a lot of complex psychological complexity going on there. I don't think it does the group any good to get involved in policing the personal conduct of the members of the group between each other. This is part of the primary purpose thing. We're here for one thing. Um, my view is that the group has no opinion on what members do with each other. Now, having said that, um, I've got eyes in my head, and I will notice if there are men who are giving women unwanted attention, for instance, or men who are giving other men unwanted attention. And other people are noticing it too. When I've seen behavior become egregious, me and a couple of other people have had a word with the gentleman in question, just quietly, doesn't need a group conscience, doesn't need a sign at the front, doesn't need a business meeting, doesn't need a witch hunt, a kangaroo court, or any of those other things. A sharp word in people's shell like does the trick. And if sometimes what you'll see is creep comes in, object to their attentions lights up like a Christmas tree. And we have to have a conversation with both sides to say, and people had it with me. They said, what are you wearing to meetings and why? Why do you go to meetings dressed like you're going out clubbing? Why are you so concerned with your physical appearance at meetings? People with when I was new addressed how I was giving out sexual signals at meetings. So everything that, but this is, in my experience, best addressed one to one between people who trust each other. It's not something I think can be dealt with by the group. Now, I think there was an American high Supreme Court justice called Felix Frankfurter who said there are matters on which reasonable people of goodwill can legitimately differ. And I think this is one of them. People have very strong views on it. But I think there are ways of handling these things informally without having to have group consciences, business meetings, policies, all of that sort of stuff. From a legal point of view, now the charity of Alcoholics Anonymous, so the foundation which manages the offices, that's overseen by the Charities Commission, and that has to have safeguarding policies in place. But that governs the work of which is organised by the General Service Office and the other branches of service. It doesn't cover the fellowship, which is we're not. Each group is not incorporated. It is not a legal entity. It's not subject in the same way to laws that, for instance, church organizations are. One thing I've noticed as well on the question of vulnerability, sometimes it's held that everyone who is new is extremely vulnerable. And when you hear the step fives, you realize people aren't as vulnerable as they sometimes make out. But there are people who are genuinely vulnerable. I know who the people are in my group who are genuinely vulnerable. And we keep an eye out for them because we love them. There we go. And we watch what is going on and we make sure people are looked after. But it's done without the whole finger pointy thing. It's the finger pointy thing, which I think is so destructive. I better stop before I say anything much more controversial on that. There was a question. Why do you think a lot of fellowship members don't want to learn the traditions? I used to go to a and I'll come to your question, Gemma, in just a moment. I used to go to a step and tradition meeting many years ago, and everyone used to sigh when it was the tradition, but then sh people were always sharing by the end of it, oh, I always sigh when it's the tradition, but then I really enjoy it. Um, Part of it is uh, I'll give you an example. In Al-Anon, the culture is that you don't apply just the 12 steps to your life. You apply the 12 steps, the 12 traditions, and the 12 concepts. So the 12 steps help me to become a whole integrated person. The traditions help me get on with others without anyone needing to push anyone else down the stairs. The concepts are there for us to get work done, again, with no one needing to be pushed down the stairs. That's what they're for. If people are exhibiting how they apply the principles of the traditions, particularly to their lives, which we're going to be covering next week, that becomes attractive. You don't need to promote it. If you exhibit it, it will make it attractive. And that's all that I think one can and need do. Gemma, you got a question? Or you'll need to unmute Gemma. Keith, I'm not sure if you can fix that. Can you send Gemma an
I've
invitation
got
to
it. I've
unmute?
got it.
Oh, there we
Sorry.
go.
My name's Gemma. I'm an alcoholic addict. Yeah. What I've been getting a bit confused about people commenting, sharing, their personal opinions on other people's shares in meetings. And I don't know whether I was being arrogant. I was looking out for the group, but I felt a bit funny afterwards when I pulled it up as crosstalk or cross sharing,
Yeah.
and read out the bit in the service thingy. Um, uh, especially when people are disagreeing or, but then the people are agreeing, and oh, I really like what you said there, and I agree with you there, or I don't know why you said that. That's a load of rubbish, or that sort of thing. Where does this lie? Thank you.
Okay, that's very, very good. So this is the idea of tradition 12 is that we talk about ideas. And to talk about the ideas, one needn't mention anything that anyone else has said. Now, you've got two formats of groups, by and large. The first type is where someone sits at the front and they say, I was born in 1967 and I had my first this on this date, and then 3 minutes before the end, they get into recovery and then they say everything is amazing and then they tell some story about an amend to a parent and then that's the end of it. And then everyone says, oh, I really like what you said about Harrogate because I went to Harrogate once and all of that sort of stuff. And people identify back. The other sort is where you read from the literature and then you each share on something from the literature. Now, the trouble is with I've been to meetings where they say, well, we have no crosstalk here. And then everyone comes back and says, I loved your chair. I loved what you said about this. I loved what you said. That's crosstalk. Um, I think it suffices to say when I hear someone speaking, so simply to say, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And then I share something about me. And I don't have to cross-reference it to what anyone else has said. And I certainly don't pick up on other things that have been said round the room during the meeting. Unnecessary. If my point doesn't stand without it, it isn't worth saying. And particularly if it's negative, there has to be, for the sake of unity, a mutual respect and a sense that what everything that is shared is valuable one way or another. And it can stand on its merits without me having to act as the prosecuting or the defense barrister. Uh, against what has been said or to support what has been said. Now, if there's a problem in the group with aggressive or just simply insensitive crosstalk, that's a question for the business meeting or the group conscience meeting. I would be very hesitant to say something during the course of the meeting. But there's something else as well about this. You stick, Al-Anon's very good at this. You stick very much to yourself. You do not mention what anyone else says. And what's terribly important as well, let's say a friend of mine, or someone I've known for donkey's years, is doing the chair, is speaking. If I share back, I absolutely won't say, "Oh, I've known you since you came in, and like it's been such a pleasure watching you grow through all," because what that's doing, it's creating a special relationship between you and them. Anyone who doesn't know who this fellow is outside the loop there. And so when I see a sponsee doing a chair, if I'm doing a chair and a sponsee is that, I'll say, make sure beforehand people are clear. We don't let on that we know each other if one is sharing back to the other. It's certainly not that one person is sponsoring someone else. So no, to avoid the name checking, that's the anonymity. And so to observe those boundaries is very good for group unity and its principles before personalities. Tony.
Hey Tim, Tony's my name, a drug addict. Just a question, Tim, about what is traditionally or conceptually the right thing, like for one person to be doing service in a number of different committees, um, in meetings and stuff like that. Like I suppose when I came around, you were told that you do service, you have one service position and that's it, in your home group or whatever you do, and you don't really take up much more after that. And that was sort of put with the spirit of rotation. Is that right, or
Very good question. Got it. So I think it matters very much where you are and how big the fellowship is, how many hands there are to man the decks. In America, where the whole thing was devised, the culture in a lot of places is for a group to have an incredibly strong group identity. And it has as many meetings a week as the people who attend the group need. So there it absolutely makes sense. You have one group, that's your home group. You only do service there, and you might visit other groups with friends on speaker night or birthday night. And some cities in the UK, Bristol is like that. You have a very strong group, and that is your group, and you're on a list of home group members. The culture in London is much more fluid. And frankly, if people were limited to doing service only in one group, there would be a real shortage of people to do service across the fellowship as a whole. And also the people that need to do service every day to frankly stay alive would not be able if once a week is your limit, it's not fair on the people who really want to be giving every day. Now, there aren't any groups in London which meet every day, or if they are, often there's actually separate groups that you'll have a group meeting at or people meeting at the same location every morning, but it's actually a different group, different entity each time. There are some multi-meeting groups, but they're rare. I think what is off is having your fingers in the pie of the running of groups. There's nothing wrong, I don't think, with doing the washing up at two groups, but one shouldn't be a secretary of more than one group. One shouldn't be certainly not a GSR. One shouldn't be a treasurer. It's all of those things. If you want to do donkey work at 7 meetings, fair play to you and good luck to you, and thank God for people like you. Someone that wants to be the secretary in 4 meetings, there's something going wrong there. So I think this is a good example of you're looking at the general principles. The general principle is that we all take up a fair share of our responsibility, but there's some flexibility there. It really depends on what the area is like geographically. Andrew.
Thanks, Tim. My question is, if someone shares in a meeting an opinion on something that is quite obviously an outside issue, but potentially very divisive to the rest of the group, how should the secretary handle that? Is it the responsibility of the secretary, and how can that be handled with tact without appearing to be a dictator?
Well, the thing is, the one time I've seen valuable interventions from the front, there was a chap somewhere in London who would get a bee in his bonnet and his knickers in a twist, which is a terrible combination. And he'd come to the meeting and he'd tell us all about the bee in his bonnet and the twisted knickers. And it always concerned other specific members of AA who he would name and then go on to list all of the wicked things they'd done. Now, that was a situation in which, of course, the secretary said, he wasn't called Bobby, but let's say he was called Bobby. Could you please stick to your own experience, strength, and hope? And there was someone else that was a little bit psychotic, and sometimes there were very unseemly things that he said. And again, we would say, Bobby, could you please stick to your own experience, strength, and hope around alcoholism? But that's when it really very much crossed the line. Now, lots of things are simply disagreeable to listen to, but they don't cross that sort of line. And honestly, within 3 minutes, it's over. And people who share that, they won't be they might share it 2 or 3 times, but then they'll get bored of it. The best way to get someone to shut up is not to react at all. Because if people, you got to understand why people are doing it. They're doing it to get a raise out of the meeting. And then if you respond back, you've fallen into the trap. That's why the sort of pathetic, thanks for sharing, keep coming back is so great, is because the bad behavior is not rewarded with special attention. It's like dealing with toddlers. Um, there's just oh golly, yes. Okay, so there's the question, I won't say who, but in the chat about um a group that separates itself because of a sponsorship line. Um, yeah, that whole thing, I don't bandy around who I sponsor. The people I sponsor don't bandy around in meetings that I sponsor them. It shouldn't be self-evident. I think it's much healthier overall. If you've got a whole lot of sponsees, which is not a bad thing, and they've got a whole lot of sponsees, don't gather them all into one place because it's not cult-like, but it can give the impression that it is cult-like. And that's the personalities coming ahead of principles. So total anonymity on that. And the thing about strong groups, sometimes you have a really strong group where you've got like 40 or 50 people who are totally reading from the same hymn sheet. What about the other groups? If those 50 people with a program were one each in 50 other meetings that day, 50 other meetings would be benefiting from that knowledge rather than all of the knowledge being centered in a single meeting where people are just in an echo chamber regurgitating the same stuff back to each other and congratulating themselves on how much better their group is than anyone else. But newcomers never stay more than 5 minutes. Best to just stand back, go where you're not known, be anonymous, stop being someone in the fellowship. Just be another alcoholic or addict. Ollie.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'm Ollie, and I'm an addict. What are your thoughts on people that, when their service is due to roll out and no one puts themselves forward and they stay in that service role indefinitely? What are your thoughts on that?
Got it. Okay. I'll come to that in a second. There's a quick one in the chat. If part of your story includes time in another fellowship, I'm going to stop there. I'm in Al-Anon, and now this is a slightly different kind of setup because we're talking about the traditions and fellowships and blah blah blah. But in an ordinary AA meeting, I might mention that I'm in Al-Anon in passing, but I speak AA in AA, and but certainly in Al-Anon, when I speak in Al-Anon, I don't give any indication that I'm also a member of AA. Now, AA and CA have got slightly different things. You're using the big book and blah, blah, blah. So the relationship is slightly different. But I think the ideal, except in settings like this when we're standing back, in ordinary regular meetings, to speak the language of the fellowship you're in. So in CA meetings, to use clean. In NA, to use NA terminology, not CA terminology or AA terminology, just to fit in with the room. With and this I think will probably be the last question, um, uh, about the rotation thing. Many years ago, in a galaxy far, far away, there was a Sunday tea commitment where someone did this meticulous tea layout, it was all terribly complicated. Um, uh, and they rotated out, but no one took it, so they rotated back in. And this happened two or three times. And eventually they found someone, but the XT person hovered over them, milling around, monitoring everything they were doing. And within 2 weeks, they walked off. And this person was then back doing the tea for another 2 weeks. It's no good for it's bad for the group, but it's worse for the person because it creates attachment is the whole problem. Entanglement, enmeshment, that's the whole problem with addiction. The solution to addiction is not connection, it's detachment. And we get glued to things, which is not helpful. This is why rotation is so important when you rotate out. Don't just rotate into another role. Don't just move a chair. Rotate all the way out. And just one last thing, and I will finish on this, Keith, the technical question in the chat. If a group has more than one meeting, should each meeting of the group have a different GSR? No, 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 no. If a group has 5 meetings, it is one group and it has one GSR and it has one treasurer. It might have alternates or little helpers to collect the money and blah, 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 but you need one person who's responsible for each of those jobs. But what I find in London, those multi-meeting groups just don't work because each day has a different culture. I don't know why it works in America, but it doesn't work in London. But it doesn't work in London. So it's best each group, one meeting, let it go at that, even if other meetings are at the same location, because that allows each meeting to develop and grow in its own way without having people from other meetings who have no dog in the race having a say on how that meeting operates. So complete freedom, complete autonomy for each individual meeting. And Tony's got a question in the chat. It doesn't say that, so that's the end of it. But a group can legitimately have a rule that you can't share until your fifth step, but that's its own group conscience, but it's not in the book. So back to you, Keith.